So what organisations are you involved or have been involved in leading in sort of recent years?
Well, I was the founder of a business that I ran for 35 years, Riverford Organic Farmers, which sort of came out of our family farm and developed into a business employing 1,000 people with 100 million turnover. And I guess that's really what I've done. And just more recently, I'm experimenting with setting up what we're calling the Badderford Collective, which is where I live. I bought a farm just up the road from Riverford, where I was born, and I'm trying to develop that with half a dozen small businesses working together to try and be viable at quite a small scale. That's quite an interesting kind of, probably
Oh,
more
wow.
sort of collaborative
Right.
project.
Is it food related businesses?
Yeah, it is actually land-based businesses. So yeah,
Right.
yeah, one group producing seeds, one perennial vegetable plants,
Wow.
another one culinary and medicinal herbs, another one plants for dyes, and another one is quite small scale vegetable production.
Wow.
And I've sort of come to really, I suppose, almost sort of loathe big business in almost all its forms. And,
Mhm.
is it possible to have an economically viable human scale business that is, gives people more autonomy and agency over their lives, but at the same time, pays them an income, let's say 1.5 times minimum wage, as being about the threshold that I think anyone vaguely entrepreneurial I would say was the minimum.
Okay.
Uh, and we'll see whether we can make it possible.
Wow. That sounds fantastic. I mean, I think as we go through the interview, it'd be great to obviously pick up on those themes around, what this idea of, I suppose what your ideas of responsible capitalism are, where you see the weaknesses in operating in capitalist economies and how you've sort of worked with that in relation to, sustainability agendas that you focused on and those kind of aspects. So I think that's really interesting, and I think it's something that we're really interested in exploring with you over the next kind of 45 minutes. So with those organizations, you've already kind of, well, if people know you, they obviously know a bit now if they've not heard from you before, but, Riverford is, I suppose, a business that people will have seen around in different ways, but also all the sort of connection you have there with sort of food, sustainable food, local food, these kind of ideas. So I suppose in terms of my next question, maybe some of the connections that you make between your role in a business or having a business and confronting kind of ecological climate emergency, maybe that's fairly sort of self-evident for some, but maybe for others it would be interesting just to hear a bit about, I mean, how do you see what you've done and what you've been doing in relation to the problems that we have, particularly around climate emergency, ecological emergency?
What's our role within that?
Yeah, I mean, how do what, in terms of what you've been doing, is that, it sounds to me like that's something
Yeah.
very sort of central to how you think about business.
Well, I suppose it's become more overt over the last 15 years. In terms of, I think we did our first carbon footprint in 2006 or 2007 and started really thinking in a more sort of analytical, in a better informed way
Right.
about how we reduce our environmental impact. And definitely the focus was on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. But I guess I've always felt that these problems are inextricably linked with, people's, well, with inequality, actually. I mean, and so sort of social justice, I think goes hand in hand with environmental justice, for future generations. And I think, I think it's very hard to separate the two. And however, conventional capitalism is incapable of dealing with that, and seems to do nothing other than further greater inequality. And I'm afraid to say I am. One has to work within the world as we find it, but rather depressingly, I think there's just an inconsistency there that I have very little hope that the challenges that we face will be met through conventional capitalist means. So I'm very, very skeptical about carbon trading, and even more skeptical about biodiversity trading. I'm skeptical about the idea that an informed consumer will drive brands to make the right decisions to reduce their carbon emissions. I just think it's so self-evidently a load of crap. Yet we have to sort of play along with it, and that is the basis of all sort of public policy. That's certainly that's merging around agriculture. Post Europe, that we're all going to replace the subsidies with carbon trading and so on, and it's it's just a disaster unfolding before us, as far as I can see.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly when we were reading your public communications, and you're somebody that we really wanted to speak with, I think one of the key aspects was this idea that you were, I suppose, challenging that mainstream view, this kind of win-win responsible capitalism idea that doing capitalist business well and doing sustainability are kind of compatible in a different way. And I think what you're saying is that you're seeing incompatibilities there, and it's kind of noticing those.
Capitalism is a very blunt instrument, and blunt instruments are best at solving simple problems, and ideally simple short-term problems. We face a very complex long-term problem, and which requires a lot of subtlety and nuanced actions and balancing different aims, and above all, it requires a very, very long-term view, and that's where capitalism, particularly capitalism that we see in the UK and the US, just doesn't deliver. It's very, very short-term. So the people who are buying carbon credits and selling carbon credits, who are planting trees on Dartmoor, most of whom will die, just like they've died, most of the ones I've seen in Africa. The people who sold those carbon credits, they don't give a damn. They're long gone. I don't know what, they'll be into trading something else now. I mean, it's, we just don't, it's just an unsuitable, mechanism. We need brave government, taking long-term decisions, as, I think we'll probably see in, I'm guessing that China will be the first country that will really crack this, because, they don't have to worry about getting re-elected probably, and are not probably, I don't quite know how their economy works, but probably not so obsessed with shareholder value either. And I think that gives them the ability to be able to make these, well-considered long-term plans, which is what we all desperately need.
So when you think about, I suppose, good leadership in the businesses that you've been involved with and continue to work with, is that and you've talked about long-term view, are there other things that you would associate with being a good leader in those businesses?
Well, I think good leaders at the moment are ones that are, well, I mean, again, sorry to keep saying it, taking a long-term view, which is the opposite of popularism, really. I mean, of knee-jerk reactions to whatever is currently, so we currently have a leader who is, a popularist leader who is, knee-jerk reactions to whatever's in the, and it's a disaster. So I would say, the very opposite of what we need. I would say Angela Merkel, was a great leader. She seemed to take bravery, I think, is important. Bravery often means, in politics anyway, and leadership, the willingness to argue for unpopular causes. Long-term view, bravery, willingness to be unpopular. And one of my mantras is that we need, the idea that the customer's always right and that everything has to be led by market forces is just, I mean, how on earth can the customer be sufficiently well informed to judge whether my vegetables are more or less environmentally damaging than Abel and Coles, or that an electric car's environmental footprint is paid off in whatever time. We know the idea that we can all make individual choices is just absurd. I mean, you'd spend your whole life, researching them, and you still wouldn't know the answer. So, and I think choice anyway. The whole idea about choice, and that's what customers want, and we, that's how we define ourselves by what we buy. Is is not true. Choice is a source of a tremendous amount of stress. I mean, unfortunately, it is quite likely how we define ourselves, but in, pretty shallow and ultimately unfulfilling ways, I think.
Okay, thanks very much. So when you think about your time leading Riverford and the other sort of roles that you're now taking on, and what do you find most challenging? I mean, you said we're working within this broader system of, capitalist governance and particular varieties that we have in the UK and what have you. I mean, are there situations where it becomes very hard for you to prioritize sustainability? I mean, do you have any examples of when you've really found it difficult?
Probably the biggest challenge for us is around, the customers always be right and you must meet their whims. And, and if they want, they'll tell us that they want to eat, seasonally, and they want to cook from scratch and so on. But then that's not how they actually behave. And they will, buy strawberries that are flown in all year, even relatively, green-minded people. So there's a sort of a hypocrisy that we're all guilty of, me included, which makes it very difficult to live up to people's more aspirational, how they feel they should live their life. But the reality about what they actually want to eat, we are, in their kitchen, there's a misbalance, and especially in the winter, going into spring and early summer, when there is the variety of produce that, in the UK is pretty limited. So we are constantly making compromises, how far are we prepared to? So at the moment we are importing Spanish broad beans. We'll quite soon get on to broad beans from my farm in France, and then we'll be on to into Devon broad beans. Actually, I think that's a step too far. I mean, bringing a broad bean from Spain where you throw 60% of it away anyway is I don't think it's something that we have to have in, March. I have to say I do really enjoy eating them. I eat quite a lot of them, but I think that's going too far. And I think I think that's an example where Riverford hasn't been brave enough in saying no, we're not. We are starting raising the drawbar from quite a quick. So we've decided we're not going to sell New Zealand apples because they had the highest carbon footprint of anything we sold by a factor of 2. And as a matter of fact, we've decided we're not going to sell anything that has a carbon footprint of more than 400 grams per kilo of CO2, and we will slowly bring that down. And maybe that within a couple of years we're not prepared to sell an Argentinian apple either, and we'll keep them in cold store in the UK for as long as we can. But I suppose there are other areas that there's constant pressure to deliver greater customer service, by which convenience, and the big thing in online retailing at the moment is reducing the time from delivery, from order to delivery. People are talking about getting it down to 20 minutes and stuff. I mean, that is an environmental disaster. I mean, you're probably quadrupling the emissions associated with delivering that from shop by having that sort of system. And any sort of time delivery slot is bad, but those very immediate ones are an absolute disaster. And contributing to emissions and blocking up our roads, and really something needs to be done about that. We've been pretty dogmatic on that one. We pass your door once a week, and that determines when you'll get your order, and that there is no flexibility in that whatsoever. I have had to fight quite hard against the more customer focused perhaps elements within the business to maintain that, but it's a kind of almost over my dead body one, that one.
So those are quite difficult conversations you've found.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be that I could say, look, it's my business, and I hear what you say, but I'm just not doing that. And even if we make less money, I don't care. We're just not doing that. Since we became employee owned 4 years ago, I can't do that anymore. Having said that, I think the now co-owners are, have just as strong views about these things as I do. And I do notice that they are probably, in some ways more radical than me. I mean, the least radical people in the business are is always the finance director, followed by the rest of the board. Actually, I don't know where it's always been like that, and they're the ones who are it's hardest. Who, whenever any commercial pressure comes on, they're the first ones to argue for, cutting corners environmentally. I mean, and that's always the case within businesses, from what I can see. The people who are actually doing stuff generally want to do the right thing. The people who are balancing the budgets get a bit upset. I think people who would deal with money all the time, that's all they can think about is money. So I mean, clearly someone has to think about money. I mean, unfortunately, but anyway, I do think the boardroom can. I think boardrooms are. I'm guessing in most instances that's where the obstruction to really taking brave action. That's where it all unfolds, and normally in front of the finance director.
And earlier on, you mentioned social justice and environmental sustainability and the connection that you see between those things. And I know from what you've written and what I know about your organisations that you've been involved in, you've transferred, I think you've mentioned it so far, to employee ownership. And could you say a bit about how you see, the way the business is structured and organised in relation to ideas of justice within the business, and how that maybe relates to environmental sustainable outcomes for businesses?
Yeah, well, I find the level of inequality in income, but more significantly in wealth, in the UK, which I think is only second only to the US, is grotesque. And rich people cause all the trouble. They consume more or less. Consumption of resources and greenhouse gas emissions are proportional to wealth. You can't. It's no one's managed to break that link, from what I read. So basically, rich people are the problem. I think certainly the richest 10% of people cause 50% of climate change, and the very poor people living in sub-Saharan Africa are virtually irrelevant. They cause something like 1 or 2% of the richest 10%. So there is, you might say, we're all on this planet. We all have, you might say, if you divided the sustainable emissions by the number of people on the planet, I think you come to somewhere between around about 2 tons of CO2 each. And we're busily belching out 6 or 8 tons. I can't remember the figures exactly, more in the US and whatever. That in itself is great, is iniquitous. And it's sort of worse than that, because there's a sort of aspiration, that we're driven by, because some people are so much wealthier than others and have so much more. It sort of drives the aspiration from other people to have those things. And, we almost worship money, and we worship entrepreneurialism and business and gathering more and more stuff. And until we sort of stop doing that, it's not what makes people happy. I mean, there's a whole wealth of evidence to suggest that, it used to be about over 50 grand a year in the UK. That's probably well out of date. Maybe it's 70 grand a year. There's no correlation between happiness and wealth. I'm absolutely sure there is at the lower end. Largely because if you're very, very poor, you have very, very few choices about how you live your life. And I feel very strongly that it's the wealthy who do have choices, where the burden, it's really them that should be leading the change. So I'm a very wealthy person, by largely good fortune, I've ended up with more money than I could have. And it's almost a challenge to try and find ways to spend that money that are not damaging, so trying to buy really good quality people, craft locally made things that trying to mend things rather than buy new things. My wife Geeti and I, we both put a huge amount. We're managing building projects, and at the moment where it's really trying to make the very most of recycled materials and actually saving what's there rather than knocking it down. And it's that sort of approach that I think particularly wealthy people really should be. And I don't know. There are friends who I can barely speak to anymore, who have a second and a third home and a in the Range Rover, the gas guzzling SUV, and probably a powerboat down in Salcombe. And I just can't. I don't know how they can go to sleep at night. They're a bloody disgrace. and we've arrived at this position where, you know, I'm a sort of embarrassment to people, that actually to be a principled, you know, liberal person is viewed as something laughable. It's even viewed as despicable, I think, by some of the more overt, you know, capitalists. And I don't know, you know, I just don't understand. You know, I know lots of wealthy people who've sold their business in a similar position to me, and all they can think about is, you know, making more money some other way. You know, really, if you've got a couple of million quid, you don't have to be very clever to make another million quid. It's so easy in this country for people, you know, with money. They pay less tax, you know, and it's very easy to accumulate more wealth. Anyway, I'm going into a bit of that. Maybe I'm getting, you know, well off. I do think, I feel very strongly the onus, you know, to set a good example and change the world and leadership falls on the wealthy. It is not the responsibility of people on minimum wage who, you know, they're not causing the problems anyway, and they have so few choices in their lives. You know, it's up to people, you know, in my position, you know, to lead the way and spend their money responsibly and spend the money, you know, on the world that they want to, and, you know, and most importantly, you know, to get rid of the current shower of people that we've got in government.
Just absolutely.
Hold them to account anyway.
Yeah. And just to focus in on the employee ownership, that's part of what your view of a more just form of organization, more just form of leading?
Yeah, I felt I had to put my money where my mouth was, really. I mean, and, you know, why should people believe that I really do honestly want to do the right thing, as opposed to I'm just playing a very clever game of building a brand, which will be worth a lot of money, you know, which is what everyone around me is doing, you know, loads and loads, so many, the huge majority of supposedly green businesses are just building a bloody brand so they can sell it, and their venture capitalist backers can leave with a wedge of money. You know, whether these are people who are, you know, putting up windmills, whether they're planting trees and selling carbon credits, whether they're touting the latest direct from farmer to consumer business model, you know, it's all just driven by building a brand. And why shouldn't anyone believe that I was just like everyone else? So it's gone into a form of ownership where it can never be sold. You know, the only beneficiaries can be, you know, the co-owners who own it, the people who supply it, and the planet. I mean, that's how it's set up. That's how it's written in law. It can't be sold. Yeah. And so I hope that gives people trust in Riverford as a business. And I, you know, in my more optimistic moments, which I don't have many of just at the moment, but I do hope that we are showing that there is, you know, there is another way. You know, we don't have to be, you know, we can strive to create harmony and beauty rather than just be driven by greed. I mean, the other element of employee ownership is, you know, that the profits are, you know, divided between the owners, co-owners. But the other thing is that they have a meaningful say over the decisions, you know, how the business is run in a day-to-day way, and even the strategy in the longer run. And they really do, so that they have a greater sense of agency, which I think is, you know, when you've fed yourself, clothed yourself, got housing, you know, that's one of the next things, isn't it? I think in the hierarchy of needs or whatever, is that, you know, people want to have a degree of control over their lives and their futures. And I guess that's part of employee ownership as well, that and the sharing of the profits being the two key things.
Okay, and because with Riverford is incorporated as a cooperative, does that enable a more?
We're not incorporated.
You're not incorporated as a cooperative.
No.
Okay.
We are. Oh, there is a formal structure for the employee ownership. We're owned by an employee benefit trust.
Okay.
And which has trustees. Some of them are elected co-owners.
Okay.
I'm one, and we have two externals. And that trust keeps an eye on what the board is doing and can sack the CEO if they want to. That's how the power is exerted. So the CEO has to run the business in accordance with both the stuff that was written down mostly by me at the beginning, but also, you know, according to the wishes of the elected staff council, co-owner council.
Okay. And is there, with thinking about your leadership there and how the business has developed, I mean, is there a drive towards, I suppose, decision making being more consensual or egalitarian in how the organisation is? How would you see
Um,
the ethos that you tried to establish?
Actually, not really. I mean, we have definitely been through a cultural change since we became employee owned in 2000, must have been 18, but we'd been thinking about it. It's 4 years now. So we'd been thinking
Okay.
about it for a long time before that, and had realized that we needed a bit of a cultural change to allow us to move to a more decentralized decision making, local decision making made by people, who are actually doing the jobs. And we've been reasonably successful at that. I think we've still got quite a long way to go. I mean, we are not, forever stopping and having meetings and consulting and whatever. And as a matter of fact, I mean, very interesting, as we were going through the employee ownership, the move towards employee ownership, something that was raised by then staff, now co-owners, repeatedly actually, was a concern that the consultation would lead to slower and less effective decision making, which I thought showed an incredible sort of sophistication, in terms of the importance of being fleet of foot and responsive and so on, and that the smaller number of people you consult, the better, more likely you are to be able to do that. And the more risks there will be in decisions, but you'll make quicker decisions. So that was actually, I found that very humbling. Just and in many ways, the ability of people who have no management experience to contribute to making good and safe decisions has, I have to say, surprised me and the rest of the board over and over again, and has actually made us, I think Rob, the CEO, was quite cautious. He used the phrase of drowning in consultation quite a lot as we approached it, and I don't think he's felt it's like that at all. I mean, the various, mainly the staff council, but have been very effective in sometimes asking questions that need to be asked, sometimes as a sort of sounding board for decisions that the board is unsure about. Something that happened last summer, it was we actually, the supply chain was being stretched a bit by, sometimes COVID-related issues. We were selling more produce than we were having to stretch our supply chain, and quality was suffering. And we were getting it came back through our customer services team that there were quality issues and we needed to look at that. And the managers on the whole just sort of brushed it off. Nah, it's nothing to worry about. It's just a little bit of this and a little bit of that. They always had an excuse for it. And it went on, and we did actually start losing some customers. And in the end, it was the staff, sorry, I keep saying staff, the co-owner council who raised this and said, we don't think the quality is good enough. They raised it repeatedly and actually sort of more or less bullied the board into doing something about it. When they should have done something about it months before. I don't know. I think there was a bit of a blind spot there, which they shone a light on, very valuably, actually. So, they were the people who were packing the vegetables and seeing the quality suffering, of what was going out the door, and it was great to hear. So it can. Our experience so far is that it has led to better decision making, and it hasn't in any way slowed down any decision that I can think of at the moment.
Okay. And one of the other aspects, I was listening to a talk that you gave for Resurgence magazine, I think it was a year or so ago now, but you talked about the development of Riverford and how you tended to keep things in-house because, and I think, and is that something in terms of I think that's partly, maybe you talked about trust and sort of, I suppose, the morality of some of the business that you might engage with, and when you were potentially outsourcing things, has that been important for sort of uncompromisingness around sustainability?
Yes, I think it has. People normally contract things out. I mean, sometimes if it's an area that you don't have expertise and you need it, and you only need it for a short period of time, it may well be that contracting it out is the right way to go. But generally, people contract out things that they don't want to take responsibility for, so it might be the cleaning, and they don't want to actually have to take responsibility for paying someone, 10 quid an hour to work in the small hours of the morning or something. So, we do all our own cleaning, we do all our own transport, we do our own sales, we do all, most of our own sort of media stuff, and we do all our own IT. Everything is done in-house. And we did, a lot of those things, particularly the IT, we were contracting out for years, and oh God, what a disaster. I mean, you're just dealing with, we're here for a long time. We're here to stay. We want solutions that will last. I mean, these companies were just absolutely despicable individuals, marking up. I mean, how anyone can mark up a computer programmer 4 times when you are actually committing to 3 years of work and they are multiplying that cost by 4. I mean, how can you do that? I mean, a builder, marks it marked by 10 to 20%. Why is it okay for a computer and they might be doing just a few weeks' work? Why is it okay for a lawyer or a computer, software development company to? It's just the absolute greed and lack of morality and lack of a long-term view of a lot of the people we were dealing with, that we just felt we could do it better ourselves, and that requires more. It's also really lazy contracting stuff out. You don't. It gives you that flexibility, doesn't it? Which can be good, but actually, we've been doing the same damn thing for 25 years, and in 25 years' time, I'm pretty sure we're going to be doing something fairly similar. I mean, it will no doubt have, morphed to some extent, but so there's, so. Why do things in short-term contracts, I suppose. So, we do, I mean, building work is contracted out, but I mean, mostly with people who, we're using the same contractor for digging drains and moving earth that my father used, 50 years ago to build his first piggery, and they're absolutely brilliant. I don't even ask him the price of things. I just say I want that done, and he does it, and he sends me the bill about 6 months later, and it's always way less than you could get anyone else to do it. And that's how we tend to. I really like, building those long-term relationships, trusting relationships, and sometimes you can do better going to the marketplace and getting 3 separate quotes and You can, there are occasions, but on the whole, my experience is that there's more to be gained from cooperating, communicating fluently with someone and building a relationship of trust, that you will end up getting a better deal than by constantly going out to the market and getting people to quote for things. And that, whether it's someone doing search engine optimization, whether it's someone selling veg boxes, at a food fair, whether it's someone doing your transport or writing your software, it all, there's the value of long-term relationships is something that it's also how I like doing business. I really enjoy those interactions. I mean, if I don't like someone and enjoy doing business with them, then it doesn't last very long. And it just makes life more fun, dealing with people in a trusting way and dealing with people that you like. And we will have next month, we have our suppliers conference, which we haven't had for 3 years because of COVID. And it's I view many of those suppliers who we worked with for 20 years as being, personal friends, and it will be a delight to see them.
Just thinking about and I guess some of these things you talked about earlier on, what needs to change. I guess you talked about, at the political level and various things. But if you're thinking about other businesses, other people that are leading other businesses, what is the scope and scale of change that they need to be thinking about in relation to climate and ecological emergency?
Timescales, I would say, just taking a long view. If you take a long enough view, what is an economic imperative and an environmental imperative, they do tend to converge. If you look at it in a long enough timescale, when you have patient enough capital. So, I think taking a long view depends very much on who owns the business and what their aspirations are. So, be very careful about who invests in your business and how and what they want out of it, I would say, and probably look for other models of ownership. I do think the venture capitalist, quick growth, top line is everything, is a very damaging model that has cost us dear And I think I think there are plenty of people who do want, want to invest patiently in businesses in the long term, and businesses that are making a positive contribution, and try and get that alignment between investors and doers, without going through the hideous, process that happens with most venture capitalist investment.
So, and earlier on, I think you mentioned about, moments that you aren't particularly optimistic when you think about, I suppose, climate predicaments or ecological predicaments. But what are some of the things that, as a last kind of question, that you find exciting, that offer some kind of hope around developing businesses in the way that you talked about? Maybe that's to do with some of the things you mentioned at the very beginning with these incubating organizations that you're involved with.
Well, I mean, if you go and talk to people outside the boardroom, outside the business community, and you describe to them carbon trading or biodiversity trading, and those people just instantly know that it's a load of crap. People know, most people are aware that, what we're doing is kind of, anyway, whether we're going about things in the wrong way and they want to see change. It's just unfortunate that people that climb to the top of the slippery pole tend to be the ones who believe in the systems that we have in business as usual. And they are promoting, the financialization of nature and trading of nature, which is absolutely doomed to fail. I mean, it's failed for 20 years. It's actually been around for quite a long time, and it's delivered, nothing other than dying forests in Africa, the inappropriately planted trees and that sort of thing. Anyway, I've said my many times. So my encouragement comes from actually the people that I speak to in the pub and on the street and whatever, and the tenants who are working with us, on this new project. There are lots of people with tremendous energy, and the emerging thing now actually is, whereas 10 or 20 years ago, the kind of do-gooders save the world seem to sort of actually lack the skills to be able to deliver very much. These are really capable people now who really want to live in a different world and want to be part of shaping a better and different world, but they just need opportunities, and they need some power, with this ever concentrating of power in the hands of just the wrong people. The people who just sort of read a summary of, Wealth of Nations and came up with some bastardized version of it in the laissez-faire market model, and they're just completely dogmatically obsessed with it. Even when it's just patently not working. Our local Conservative MP told me, we didn't need to worry about agricultural policy because regenerative farming is already changing it. People wanting to buy regenerative farming food products are changing the way that farming. This is what he said. This is one of our MPs. He actually said, "So, Anthony, where do I go and buy something that's regeneratively farmed?" Oh, no answer to that. Well, I think perhaps you might have thought that through before you spouted such a load of crap. And that's what, it's unbelievable, isn't it, that we're going to financialize our and send our refugees to Rwanda. I mean, it's just completely doomed. I mean, everything has to be traded. Anyway, I'm going way off point, aren't I, Stephen? But yes, I have a huge amount of faith in most people's desire to be part of the solution, and even willingness to make some sacrifices. But those are just not the people who are in power at the moment. And how we break that cycle of the wrong people being in power, that's the challenge.
Thanks very much, Guy. It really is. It's wonderful to be able to chat to you and hear you. Thank you very much.